You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Stars. Lisa Tadeo's best-selling book is about to become your favorite new show. Based on a true story, the new Stars original series, 3 Women, stars Shailene Woodley as Gia, a grieving and struggling writer who embarks on a cross-country road trip where she meets 3 women determined to radically change their lives. This one is not to be missed. Watch the season premiere of 3 Women now, only on Stars and the Stars app.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Sir Richard Evans, the author of many amazing history books, but also the newly released Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. Richard, how's it going?
Thank you very much, first of all, for welcoming me onto the podcast. And it's going very well, actually. It's on the bestseller list in the UK, and I hope it'll get there in the US as
well. I have read it. It is a fantastic read, and so I've got some questions for you about it.
Okay, happy to try and answer them.
Okay. So you've written a lot about Nazi Germany, but in the preface of this work, you mentioned that it was interesting to kind of come at this period of history from a different perspective, a biographical one, which is how this book is built. Could you talk about how that resulted in maybe a different book than your earlier efforts?
Yeah, well, gladly. About 1998 or 9, I was asked to be an expert witness in a defamation or libel trial in which David Irving, a writer about World War II and other things, sued the American historian Deborah Lipstadt for libel because she called him a Holocaust denier and a falsifier of history. And I was asked to serve as an expert witness and read his stuff and so on. You can bone up on it in a movie, a very good movie called Denial, starring Rachel Weisz and others. And I was asked by the lawyers in the case, could I recommend a good, large-scale, detailed history of Nazi Germany to them? And I couldn't, because the really good ones were now pretty out of date, and the recent ones were really not very good. So, as is the way of things, I decided to write by myself. And it was going to be originally 1 volume, and then it came 2, and eventually 3. So it's a trilogy on the Third Reich. It's a narrative history, and the 3rd volume came out in 2008, and I moved on to other things, other subjects. But just in 2019, I was asked to take part as what we call a talking head on a TV series called Rise of the Nazis, which is 9 full-length programs, and it took a biographical approach. And so, in helping prepare for the programs and advising on historical matters, I was drawn back to biographies, and I discovered that while biographies have been very unfashionable through the second half of the 20th century, largely because of the cult of personality, the cult of the individual, so-called great men, and so on during Nazi Germany, that now there are a lot of, just since the turn of the century, a lot of new biographies. Biography had become okay again, as it were, among professional historians, a new generation, and huge amounts of documents had been published. It's quite surprising, really. But Nazi Germany, you think everything come out about Nazi Germany, but it hadn't at all. So Goebbels' complete diaries were found in a Russian archive and published. The last of 32 volumes came out in 2008. Diaries of the Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg were published in 2015 in full. It's the second volume of Heinrich Himmler's appointments diary. the head of the SS. That only came out a couple of years ago after being discovered in an obscure Russian archive. So there's a lot of new material approached to them. Two major biographies of Hitler, the great biography by Ian Kershaw and a really very good one by Volker Ulrich, German journalist and historian. So there's a massive amount of new material to deal with. And I thought, well, why not look at the whole subject again, following my narrative history published in the early 2000s, and then look at it all through a biographical lens. So I researched and wrote and published this book, which has just come out on August 13th, as you said, called Hitler's People, The Faces of the Third Reich. And there's 22 biographies, chapters, starting off with one on Hitler and then going on through the kind of top echelon of Nazis and then the kind of middle rank and then down to ordinary, which you might call ordinary mass murderers, fellow travelers and sympathizers. So, and the question that unites them all is, why did people become Nazis, and why did they stick with it, or why didn't they see that it was involving the most horrendous crimes? So that is the book, and I use a lot of relatively recently discovered material, it came out, as I said, on August 13th.
Yeah, I really liked kind of how the book was structured, kind of, as you mentioned, a series of mini biographies on a variety of different people. There are a lot of names in that book that everybody who's going to buy this book has already heard of, because that's just how it goes. But then there are some that I bet they will not have heard of, almost certainly. So kind of, how did you end up with the list of individuals that are present in the book?
Well, like many historians, I go with the sources, so where there are diaries available, I went after them. Where the people are very, not very well covered in source material, Martin Bormann in particular, kind of grey eminence of the later years of the Third Reich, there's very little material to go on. So I left him out. I chose a very obscure general called Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, whose diaries have been published, and they answer questions about the army and its involvement in Nazi crimes. Again, there's a figure whom I kind of end with called Louisa Zollmitz, a perfectly, completely ordinary Hamburg retired school teacher who left huge diaries. I mean, 700 pages of closely spaced, crabbed handwriting for every single year, going through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on. And so I chose her, although they're very, very difficult to read. Trying the handwriting, it's very such as would take years to decipher. But there's a good German historian called Beate Meyer who's had a good go at it and is able to tell interesting things about Zollmitz, who was not a Nazi. She was a patriotic, nationalist, conservative, who started off by being hugely enthusiastic about the Nazis and ended up in the war by really losing all her support for them and starting secretly denouncing.
Yeah, it's interesting that the book kind of goes from Hitler at the beginning, all the way at the top, all the way down to a school teacher, and multiple sort of steps along the way.
That's right, yes. I mean, I took as my model a book called The Face of the Third Reich by a German journalist and very good conservative historian called Joachim Fest, which came out at the beginning of the 1960s. And that book then does it the same way. It has a opening long chapter on Hitler and then goes through the major people. But I decided he tried to do representative figures like the general or the intellectual and so on. And I chose specific people, but I had the same kind of structure. Fest's book was one of the very first overall surveys of Nazi Germany to be published in German. It's very well written. He was a journalist. He knew how to write. But it's, of course, incredibly outdated now, over half a century ago.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Are there things you would love to learn, but as an adult, it's hard to make time to learn new things? Sometimes it feels like the desire, the ability, gets lost in childhood. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder and rediscover your curiosity. Any time is the best time to start your back to school era, and that is where BetterHelp comes in. BetterHelp is entirely online, so you can do it from the coziness of your own home or anywhere else you want to, for that matter. And to get started, all you have to do is fill out a questionnaire which will help match you with a licensed therapist. It's easy, convenient, flexible, and it removes as many barriers as possible between you and therapy. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/WWII to get 10% off of your first order. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/WWII. While this podcast is about events in history, we all live in a modern world with modern problems. And one of those problems is keeping your private information, well, private. Information of all types can get out there, and it can be difficult to know about it, let alone do anything about it. That's where Incogni can help. With identity theft on the rise, Incogni can help by making sure that data brokers online remove your data. Unfortunately, this is not a one-time request and requires constant monitoring and removal requests, which Incogni can take care of automatically. Use promo code SWW at incogni.com/SWW for 60% off an annual plan. That's code SWW at incogni.com/SWW. Yeah, and kind of speaking of you picking out specific people, one of the features individuals, as you already mentioned, was General Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, who feels like a very typical German military officer to me. You know, long service even before Hitler came to power, some complaining about Hitler's policies in his personal writings, but when the chips were down, he was still loyal to Hitler and to the Nazis. And I'm going to pull a quote from the book, which has caused me to ask you about von Lieb. I'm going to quote here. Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb was not a particularly outstanding general, nor a particularly idiosyncratic personality. It was precisely his lack of pronounced personality traits that made him interesting. Could you talk about that statement a little bit?
Yeah, he's interesting because he's boring, basically. So, I mean, he kept these diaries which are published, but they're really there's nothing sensational in them, but they're very interesting in a lot of ways. I mean, he, as you said, he was not an outright Nazi, but he was an anti-Semite. And in fact, anti-Semitism runs right through all of these biographies without any exception at all. Even Louisa Solmitz, the school teacher, had nothing to do with the Jewish community, or even though her husband was actually Jewish. She, in conservatives in Germany, did not. They were generally anti-Semitic to one degree or another. Ritter von Leeb was in fact in charge of the Army Group North, which besieged Leningrad and took part in a lot of military action before he was retired in the middle of the war. And he complains in his diary. He's been talking to one of his colleagues about the way that the SS, the black uniformed ultra Nazi kind of thugs of the regime were massacring Jewish people where they came across them in northern Russia after the invasion, and in Poland. I mean, everywhere. So he complains about it, and he and his friend agree. I mean, he actually complains sufficiently for Hitler to send one of his people, one of his adjutants, to tell them it's nothing to do with them. They should stick to soldiering, and not involve themselves in politics. And he knuckles under. He agrees with his colleague. Perhaps the best way to deal with the Jewish problem, which causes a problem entirely invented by the Nazis, is to have all male Jews sterilized. It's astonishing admission. And he continues to be a bit sort of grumbles away, but he's given a big estate in southern Germany by Hitler as a present. And he just crumbles. He just, in fact, his last complaint is that the estate isn't big enough. So Hitler gives him a bit more. And that's his example of I wanted to show how top soldiers and other people were kind of bribed by Hitler. Hitler, if he knew they weren't thoroughly supportive of him, he would bring them around by giving them money and land and all of those things. And incidentally, the estate's still in the family.
Yeah, I guess there are ways to get people to be loyal.
That's right.
For sure.
Exactly. So yeah.
Okay.
And of course, he wasn't a famous, brilliant or so-called brilliant general like Guderian or Rommel. I chose him precisely because he was not.
Yeah, yeah, he a little more, maybe representative of the average instead of
That's
these
right.
sort of
That's right.
outstanding
Yeah.
characters that often get discussed.
Yeah.
Okay, and then but one of the reasons I really like the book and I found it really interesting is because the structure allowed you to dig into these deeper topics, these individuals that people have never heard of, um,
Yeah.
and certainly do not make appearances in books about Nazi Germany. I've read many of them, but one example of this was your chapter on Gertrude Schultz Klink, the
Yeah.
Reich's women's leader. So, what was her role in a society that was not exactly interested in empowering women?
Which is one of the most male chauvinist, male supremacist regimes there's ever been anywhere. I suppose only the Taliban in Afghanistan are kind of more obviously male chauvinist, although Hitler kept on the women's right to vote through his regime. But then, of course, there was no freedom to vote for who you wanted. You had to vote for Hitler and the Nazis. And Gertrude Scholz-Klink, as you said, the so-called Reich women's leader. And like many of these figures, she's been kind of mythologized. And in particular, some men like Reinhard Heydrich and women like the concentration camp guard Irma Gräser have been demonized to such an extent that what they're accused of doing bore no resemblance at all to what they had actually done, which is bad enough. And Gertrude Schultz Klink was said to have been the kind of Hitler for women, as it were, a kind of massive ruler of the whole female gender. And she wasn't at all. She had no power. It was men who called the shots in Nazi Germany. So I want to kind of strip away that idea. What she did was to as it were, bring round women to support the regime and more of a kind of propaganda than anything else. She ran two big women's organizations under the Nazis, but the policies they followed, of course, were Nazi policies. And I chose her also because she represented another kind of trait I found in virtually all of these people, insofar as they survived World War II. And she did, into great old age, towards the end of the 20th century. She had no remorse, no regrets. Just claimed that what she'd done was all for the good of women.
It's interesting that you mentioned that maybe other people within the regime or within Germany kind of portrayed these women differently. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Irma Gräser was a concentration camp guard, and put on trial for atrocities. And Ilse Koch was the wife of a concentration camp commander, and they were pilloried in the press, the international press, who accused them of all kinds of sexual perversions, for example, but there's no evidence at all, and of sadism. And Geza was, in fact, I think, rather ignorant, simple country girl who became a camp guard and was quite brutal towards the prisoners whom she regarded, as did many other camp guards, both genders, as kind of criminals and subhumans and so on. But she didn't do the things she was accused of doing. In a way, it's rather strange that she was singled out and executed, though she was said to be very, very beautiful. And she was only in her early 20s. I'm trying to find a photograph that illustrated that, but she doesn't look very good, very nice in the photographs I found. Anyway, so this kind of, women who took part in the Nazi regime were basically demonized because it was felt that they had departed from what the proper way of behaving for women was. And there's even some historians have argued that women were perpetrators, not because they did violent or sadistic things, but also because they provided a kind of refuge for men who were fighting at the front, a kind of domesticity. And that, of course, ignores the extent to which they did participate in the regime and enforcing its rules and propagandizing its ideology, like Schultz Klink did.
So you mentioned earlier, you mentioned that Martin Bormann is not in the book because of a lack of sources. Were there any other people who you couldn't include because you couldn't find what you needed to kind of make a chapter work?
Well, the book is 600 pages long, so I didn't want to make it kind of, unwieldy. I remember reading a review of one very, very long book that said that this is shaped like a brick and gives a new meaning to the concept of building a library. But so 600 pages is enough. So that I could have gone on. I could have written twice as much, but those I can't. There are plenty of people I could have dealt with as well.
Okay.
So, for example, lawyers. I mean, I chose as a representative of the professions, university qualified professions, Karl Brandt, who was a surgeon who, by a series of chances, really, and that's quite common in Nazi Germany, was appointed head of the action to kill up to 200,000 mentally handicapped and mentally ill Germans. And he was in charge of that. He was tried after the war and sentenced to death, executed by an American court. And he had no consciousness whatsoever that he'd done anything wrong. He just kept on saying, even on the scaffold, that he'd only tried to improve the quality of the human race and he'd been benefactor of the human race. In the end, the executioner got fed up with his ranting about how good he'd been and just popped a sack over his head and pulled the lever, and that was it for him. There are many lawyers who are very similar to that, professors, scientists, and so on, but I chose him as a representative of the professions.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of this kind of shows the broad spectrum sort of appeal or support for the Nazi regime in Germany, where it's all these different kinds of people from all these different kinds of walks of life, and they're all there, playing their part, I guess.
Yeah. We have to remember that the Nazis never won more than 37% of the vote in a free national election. That was in November 32, just at the end of the so-called Weimar Republic. There's always a majority of people at the beginning who did not support the Nazis, mainly socialists and communists. And Goebbels gave a speech, and Joseph Goebbels, the head of the propaganda section of the Nazi regime, gave a speech in the beginning of the regime in 1933, where he says, look, we haven't won a majority. We've got to convince everybody else that don't support us. We've got to convince them that's propaganda. And indeed, he was appointed by Hitler to head up a ministry for propaganda and public enlightenment, as it was called. And I think it had some effect. When you've got no free press, no independent cultural organizations, everything is, as the Nazis said, coordinated by the regime, and everything is pumping out the Nazi view of things. Of course, that has an effect, especially on the younger generation.
We've talked a lot about the contents of the book. Could you share a bit about what prompted you to kind of write the book in the first place?
I wrote it partly because we're living in a period when democracy is under threat, when would-be and real strong men, dictators, authoritarian leaders have made a bit of a comeback, as it were. And so I thought that reading about the Nazis and the Nazi leadership and the Nazi followers as individuals would actually be useful for the present day discussion. I don't tell people what to think, and I don't believe that history repeats itself, as Mark Twain is supposed to have said. History doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And I want people to do a bit of work, actually. I want the readers to figure out for themselves what they think about the Nazi regime and what it can tell us about threats to democracy in the present day.